do you have a definition of evil that you're comfortable with, and do you agree that it is more of a one of the criticisms of Christianity and of monotheistic religion in general is it describes the world as a place of conflict between the forces of good and evil, whereas my view as a philosopher is I think the two are very unalike. I think good is very multiplicious and diverse and not necessarily antagonistic toward evil, except that it's not the same. Whereas evil has a homogeneous quality because of how I define it, and I define it as the purposeful destruction of creative potential. So if I were to chop your arm off, let's say, you might think that the evil is contained in the act of chopping the arm off or the actual arm that is chopped off. But for me, what makes the act evil as opposed to just bad is the fact that I'm depriving you of all the possible future activities you could have done with that arm. And so it is not just the object that is destroyed or the act. It's not the perpetrator or the victim, but the potential which is harmed, which to me is intrinsic to the definition of evil. And in that sense, I don't think good and evil are fundamentally opposed. It's just good is, you can think of good in the terms of goods and services. Like you have all kinds of good music and good foods you like, but they're not opposed to the bad, to poison. It's not like all the good foods and poison are like locked in a war. Evil is antagonistic toward good, but good does not seem to me at any rate, to be locked in a struggle with evil. And I don't know if the religious heritage is particularly useful. Think, for instance, the myths in Genesis or the apostles' parables and so on. I don't know if they are particularly useful in understanding evil. But I just wanted to know if you've had a definition you felt comfortable with.
Evil is not something that I think very much about. I don't personally find it to be a very useful concept. I mean, I'm open to being persuaded otherwise there, but I talk about good quite a lot in a similar sort of way to you, I think. I mean, there's many things we can describe as good and contributing to a good life, a good society. I think evil is not similarly a useful concept. And one of the reasons for that is because of, well, at least my sense of it is the very extreme nature of the way the term is used and deployed, say to describe a person or maybe a group or an action. I think that people use the word evil often when they don't want to have to understand something about why it happened or why someone did that, and when they want to dissociate themselves completely. So a good example, of course, is Nazi Germany and Hitler, right, which is something that people would often describe as evil, and not without reason. But I think one of the problems with that language is that it is so extreme and kind of othering that it makes us feel like that's those things that happened, all those things that were done, the attitudes that were held, are things that only those evil people could do, or some kind of demonic forces somehow caused it to happen. I mean, not saying that one necessarily believes in that metaphysically, but it puts it in a very different category than just than ordinary people making mistakes or having bad beliefs, which then self-radicalize and things like this. I mean, obviously there's a lot to that situation to unpack, and it is extreme in certain ways. But I guess the point is, when we deploy the notions of evil, I think we make it harder for us to understand why things like that happen, and to critically reflect in ourselves and our own society as to what similar trends might exist, or are we partly in that direction, or what commonalities might we have, or why was that popular at the time, all these sorts of things. We just sort of write it off as, oh, that was evil. And of course, we never think of ourselves as evil, or generally the people we know. And so that is, I think, both makes it harder for us to understand, and as sort of an intellectual abdication of responsibility to understand, and then to hold ourselves, to a standard to avoid that. Now, I'm not saying that the concept of evil necessitates that you deploy it that way, but I think it has that risk because of, well, perhaps it's because of the religious tradition of, thinking of evil as sort of satanic and as being the utter opposite of God. God is perfectly good and Satan is like the ultimate evil. And there's not a lot of sort of nuance in that, or way that we can draw a direct connection to that in a way that there, I think, is in any real case of people doing things, where there's always a question of, well, what led them to do that? What are the social conditions, and on what conditions would you do different things? And there's more of a calling, I think, to us to think about that and understand it. So in broad terms, I would suggest that we don't really need a concept of evil, and we should adopt more nuanced language to understand horrific crimes and things that have happened throughout history. And maybe it's possible to rehabilitate evil and use it in a cautious way in certain very extreme for certain very extreme bad actions or actors. But I just personally don't see the need.
Well, you say, oh, look, I mean, we both agree there's a major distinction between mildly bad things and severely bad things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, in some sense, I'm just using evil to refer to severely bad things, which is why I like the focus on the destruction of potential, because it is in those instances in which we regard things as being especially bad, it's because what is harmed or destroyed is not just an actual property, but future potential. Like, for instance, people always ask, why is it bad to kill someone? Obviously, part of the answer is you will prevent them from being alive. You'll prevent them from living the life that they would have lived. But you're also preventing them from living all the possible lives which they could have lived. Setting aside the free will debate, which I think is irrelevant to this because people act voluntarily, even if not freely.
Yeah.
Put that distinction to a side. I do think that the distinction between actuality and potentiality is very relevant for ethics. And again, people say the atheists, why their favorite question, why is it bad for you to kill someone if you don't believe in God? Well, I have a specific answer to this question. I think it's relevant because their answer is faith-based, but I think a wisdom-based answer is better. So I think the reason it's wrong for me to kill someone is not because I know they are of divine worth or made in the image of God, but because I don't know how valuable their life is. And so it's my awareness of my ignorance which grounds my actions fundamentally in relation to other people. Just imagine you're in the First World War, you're in the trenches, and you're shooting at people. You have no idea, which lives. Are you going to shoot a Tolkien or are you going to shoot Hitler? You have no idea. And then there's a whole question again: what makes war wrong? What made the First World War wrong? Well, it's not so much what we know it will do. It's what we don't know it will do. It's the risks which it entails and the value which we don't know is being destroyed. That is the real ethical concern. And so I think we can ground ethical intuitions in our awareness of our ignorance of the value of things. And to me, that is what divine worth means. If you want to make a distinction between the sacred and mundane or the divine and the mundane, to me, very pragmatically, I would say that the mundane is that which is relatively calculable worth, and the sacred or the divine is a relatively incalculable. So I have no difficulty with that as an atheist, that the value of your life is sacred or divine, in as much as I don't know how much it's worth to you, to other people in the future, etc. I mean, you could be a really miserable son of a bitch, but you could stop a kid running into the road, and that kid you stopped running into the road turns out to be a super valuable person. So it's my awareness of my ignorance that can ground my belief. And I think that's a better basis for ethics than faith. That I shouldn't do something because it's God's divine IP. God says I shouldn't harm someone, so...
Well, I mean, I'm certainly in agreement there that entirely grounding morality in God's commands without further discussion about what grounds those commands or what status they have is very unsatisfactory. I think it's a very low stage of moral development if that's a level one reaches. I'm not sure that I agree with the idea that about the distinction between the mundane and sacred in terms of sort of calculability or knowability. To me, that seems to be valorizing ignorance in a way that I'm not sure I like, but perhaps I'm not quite understanding the thrust of your argument there.
Well, I think an easy way to understand my intuition here is to consider suicide. So you might have a wide variety of reasons for thinking that the world would be a content warning. We're going to discuss suicide for a second here from a philosophical perspective. You may have a variety of reasons for thinking that the world would be a better off place without you, and you may have an awful relationship with yourself such that you're filled with self-loathing. So you both make some kind of, you make some consequentialist account of how the world would be a better place without you, and you have a bad relationship with yourself, so you feel justified in committing suicide. But then there's also the relationship that you have with other people, and also your future potential. And you're ignorant of the value which you have to other people, and you're also ignorant of your future potential. And so the argument against suicide to me is very similar to the argument against killing. Both are based on your ignorance of the both actual and potential value which you have to other people and to the world at large, both at present and in the future. I think I think ignorance is super important there.
Well, I mean, it is from a practical perspective, and I guess that's part of what we mean by potential, is that it's not actualized and therefore not knowable, at least in many cases. Though I would say that
I think it's one of the reasons, for instance, by the way, just to interject, that we tend to think killing younger people is worse than killing older people. It's not typically articulated, but part of the assumption is, well, we don't know what they could have been or done.
Yeah, I guess I personally would. I mean, I agree that the human potential is very important as a component of understanding right and wrong and the value of life and things like that. I wouldn't personally, and insofar as potential is non-actualized and therefore in some sense not known or even knowable, then it sort of relates to what you're saying. But I would say personally that it's not the unknowability as such that gives it importance. It's the future actualization of good states or desirable states, like relating to others, for example. Not whether we know that those will or not exist. Because if you somehow had perfect foresight, then I don't think that human potential would count for less, just because you sort of removed our veil of ignorance. So to me, it's not the ignorance that is important. It's the future value states themselves.
So this is really interesting, though, because removing that veil of ignorance is clearly dangerous, in as much as if we assess people's IQ and other genetic variables, we could make certain assumptions about them. Whether those assumptions turn out to be prejudicial or whether they turned out to be correct, they become self-fulfilling beliefs about how we treat those people. And so I think there is actually an immense value to this veil of ignorance, certainly historically, which is now potentially being threatened. I think it's interesting because this ignorance of the potential value of someone's life is a very solid rational foundation for ethics, which doesn't require much in the way of theorizing or argumentation or rationalization either. You can you're kind of awe-inspired at the immensity of your ignorance, and so you say, okay, I won't harm this person in an irreversible way or a severe way. But yes, if we could know more about the potential of people, when we do know more about them, and when we think we know more about them, if for ideological or other reasons, that knowledge can itself be dangerous. And this is where this ties into the whole theme of Genesis, right? The potential danger of knowledge. It's a really interesting theme in Christianity, isn't it? For the same religion which says, the truth shall set you free, it also has the knowledge of good and evil being the forbidden knowledge in the Garden of Eden. Yeah. I wonder if you think, yes, this question of ignorance and knowledge, well, I got to take a pause here. Implicit to this whole discussion is the common sense definition of wisdom, which I'm sure you know, which is awareness of your ignorance, or awareness of the extent of your ignorance. That's a popular definition of wisdom. And I think it's useful. Yeah, you're not comfortable with valorizing ignorance, and I suppose then you're not comfortable with my distinction between what is of divine worth, because I think there is a basic distinction there in terms of relatively calculable, relatively incalculable values, or relatively measurable, relatively immeasurable. Do you think that's a meaningful distinction? Is that a way of engaging with what religious people care about without retaining a belief in the supernatural?
Well, I mean, it's clearly a way, and I've heard sort of similar points being made, maybe in slightly different ways before. I guess I personally don't resonate with that very strongly. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons for this. One is because the notion of sort of measurability or knowability more generally, that's it
is modern, and I'm deliberately using calculable precisely
I don't have
because
an issue with that.
Precisely because of our historical epoch is one in which prudence as a virtue takes on greater significance, which is why we see the rise of consequentialism, utilitarianism, etc. And especially if you're a large organization, you have lots of information or you have lots of power, you can know a lot, you can forecast a lot, and therefore you have to make decisions about what you can and can't calculate, what you should and shouldn't calculate, etc. And so awareness of ignorance, measurability, calculability takes on sorry, I just wanted to, because people may not know why I've used that term, but
that's I think that's fine, and that is an important insight about the importance of measurability and risk is, I mean, it's always been important, but it's particularly important in the modern context, and probably will become increasingly important as society develops. But what I would say about that as a foundation for anything about morality or otherwise, or as a replacement for religion, is that it seems very relativistic to me, because what is measurable or even knowable is dependent on our current scientific and technological and philosophical developments, right? Things that were previously unknowable are now knowable, and there probably were many more things that we don't know now that we will, at some point in the future, figure out how, will determine how to know, or at least know a lot more about them. I'm not saying that we'll ever know everything, of course, but I don't know that there's any in principle. Well, I mean, there's certain things that you can show are unprovable in formal disciplines, but speaking more generally, I don't know that there are very principled, specific limits to what our knowledge could be. It could always be forever expanding as we learn more and more, for all I know. And so for me, the idea that certain things, the division between calculable and incalculable, or knowable and unknowable, is not fixed. It's constantly moving. And for that reason, I mean, it's obviously of interest, because I think I value knowledge a lot, and I think that it's important to develop knowledge and to foster that. But it's not important from the point of view of making some sort of existentially important distinction between like the mundane and the transcendent, because that's really just what is measurable is really just a function of how much we've learned to know as a species or as individuals. And so for me, that's not what kind of marks a fundamental distinction of value.
Well, I'm trying to rehabilitate this phrase "divine worth" because I think it's a concession we can make to religious worldview that is meaningful. I do think that there is. In any case, I'd love to get into the weeds on that, perhaps another time.
Yeah, sure.
But it's the interesting thing for me is a lot of the time, our ethical disposition has a lot to do with our well-being. You know, it's far easier to be benevolent if you're in a comfortable position.
Yeah, absolutely.
But before I turn on to the question of love, the question of knowledge is especially interesting, because if you look at Gnosticism as a loose category term, the fundamental distinction between it and orthodox forms of religiosity, monotheistic religiosity, especially orthodox forms of Christianity, is that Gnosticism prioritizes the acquiring of some special tacit or mystical knowledge, the gnosis in question, as the path to salvation or enlightenment or transcendence or what have you, as opposed to following traditional interpretations or established authorities on scripture. That's a very, very loose distinction. And various authors, Jung and others, have described modernity as kind of taking a Gnostic term in terms of its valorization of knowledge and the rest.